And good afternoon, everybody, or good evening. We have a fairly global audience here, so we're very pleased to have people calling in from all over the world. Welcome to the University of San Francisco and to our online program today. My name is Kerr Gibbs. I'm the executive in residence here at USF with a particular focus on China. I previously had the honor of serving as the president of the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai. Today's event is brought to you by USF's Center for Business Studies and Innovation in Asia Pacific in partnership with Griffith University, and we're going to hear from them in just a minute. Today's event, which we're calling Fruits of Discord and 7 Years of Sino-American Animosity, is an important and very timely discussion with up again and down again conversations between the Biden administration and Xi Jinping. And before that, we experienced, of course, 4 years of the Trump administration, which had its own impact on the relationship between the United States and China. And now, as we approach the November election, which is expected to again feature President Trump versus Biden, an assessment of what has transpired between the United States and China could not be more important or timely of a discussion. So we have the exact right person to address this topic, and we're very lucky indeed and appreciative to have Ambassador Chaz Freeman. I'm going to introduce him properly in just a minute, but first let's hear from our partner for this event. We're very pleased to be partnering today with Griffith University. And with that, I'd like to introduce Professor Gloria Ge. Gloria.
Thank you, Kerr, for your warm introduction. I'm Gloria Ge, Deputy Director of Griffith Asia Institute, Griffith University from Australia. It is our great honor to co-sponsor today's webinar, The Fruits of Discord, 7 Years of Sino-American Animosity. This topic is of great importance to Australia. China is the largest trading partner of Australia. Unfortunately, there has been some tension between Australia and China in recent years, but the relations are improving. Chinese Premier Li Qiang is expected to visit Australia in June this year as Beijing prepares to lift some sanctions on Australia's exports, including live lobsters. On the other hand, according to a 2023 survey by Lowy Institute, a think tank based in Sydney, that the vast majority of Australians, actually 82%, see the alliance between the United States and Australia as very important and feel important to Australia's security. At the same time, 3/4 of Australia, 74%, thinks the alliance makes it more likely that Australia will be joined into a war in Asia. It is fair to say that Australia has a delicate dance between the United States and China. I look forward to hearing Mr. Freeman's insights on China-American relationship and the discussion led by Mr. Gibbs. I would also like to take this opportunity to quickly introduce Griffith University and Griffith Asian Institute. Griffith University was an Australian pioneer in Asian and environmental studies. Modern Asian Studies was one of our 4 foundation programs. Griffith Asian Institute is one of the largest research institutes at our university, and we have more than 80 members and over 30 adjunct members, covering a wide range of disciplines. You're welcome to visit our website to find more about us and also including our publications. So recently, we just published a Griffith Asia Pacific Strategic Outlook 2024, which we hope serve as a platform for understanding challenges and opportunities within the region, addressing both local and global sustainable development priorities. Griffith Asian Institute has a wide range of networks in Asia. We're excited to extend our network by working with the Center for Business Studies and Innovation in Asia Pacific, as I believe we have so many common interests, such as business engagement, economic well-being, and a safe and secure world. Today is our first collaboration, thanks to Professor Yang's invitation, and I think we have more to come in the future. Now I pass back the microphone to Mr. Gibbs. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Ge. I think you make an excellent point that the relationship between the United States and China, it touches so many other partners And so it's really a pleasure to have your organization join the discussion. So thank you for that, Professor Ge. With that, let me just briefly introduce Chaz Freeman. Chaz Freeman has had a long and distinguished career serving in the United States government with a list of honors and accomplishments that's really far too long to list here. But the most important parts of it that I personally find most relevant and interesting are a few particular points. Number one, he could actually be delivering his remarks today in Mandarin Chinese, which I find very impressive indeed. Ambassador Freeman was actually the principal American interpreter during the President Nixon's path-breaking visit to China in 1972. So he literally was there in the room when this relationship, the modern relationship, began. Ambassador Freeman also served in the embassy in Beijing and was the director of Chinese affairs at the State Department. Ambassador Freeman also has very broad regional experience as well. He served as U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia, as well as other posts. His experience in Africa and the Middle East, which is very important because we seem to be competing with China for influence in those theaters. So we're really delighted to have this opportunity to speak with you, Ambassador Freeman. And also, while I'm at it, I want to also invite our audience to get involved in this conversation. I would invite you to go ahead and, as Ambassador Freeman makes his remarks, go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we can collect those and address those questions when he's finished with his speech. So with that, over to you, Ambassador Freeman.
Thank you very much, Kerr, and thank you, Professor Ge. It's really a great pleasure and honor to be back at the University of San Francisco and to meet Griffith University. I'm going to give you about a 45-minute lecture, and that's what I was asked to do. And as Kerr said, it's going to be a review of how we're doing in this struggle between the two countries, the United States and China. 7 years ago, then President Trump launched a U.S. trade war on China. In accordance with contemporary American praxis, this was a forever war, a constantly widening and escalating campaign with an ever heavier military component, open-ended objectives, no criteria for judging success or failure, and no strategy for its termination. 7 years into open economic and technological war on China, it's surely time to take stock of results to date. So I want to address the many ways in which Sino-American antagonism is changing China, Asia, the United States, and the world political economic order. The Biden administration has proclaimed 3 high-minded goals for U.S. policy toward China, and I quote, 1, to invest in the foundations of our strength at home, our competitiveness, our innovation, our resilience, our democracy. 2, to align our efforts with our network of allies and partners, acting with common purpose and in common cause. And 3, to compete responsibly with the PRC to defend our interests and build our vision for the future, unquote. This agenda effectively plays to the crowd. It deems China to be an adversary and conspicuously omits any reference to cooperation with it. Its 3 points boil down to getting our national act together, I'm all for that, convincing other countries to help us retard or reverse the rise of China, and blocking China from gaining international influence at the expense of our continued global primacy. How are we doing at this? It's time for a point-by-point assessment. First, are we becoming more competitive relative to China or less? The World Economic Forum, the Swiss-based voice of financialized capitalism, continues to rank the United States as the world's most competitive economy. Perhaps we deserve this ranking in terms of our capital markets and financial services, though, as Woody Allen once complained, quote, not only is there no God, just try to find a plumber on Sunday, unquote. But the most relevant and comprehensive measure of competitiveness is the annual ranking by the World Competitiveness Center at the International Institute of Management Development, IMD. The IMD measures competitiveness by factoring 340 distinct criteria over time. In 2002, the IMD ranked the United States #1 in competitiveness. By 2020, it had downgraded us to number 10. China's current policies may, like ours, now be causing it to slip a bit, but over the same period, it rose from 28th to 17th. The trends seem clear, and they do not favor us. Of course, indices, even the best of them, are artificial. They fall into Mark Twain's category of lies, damn lies, and statistics. But the actual performance of economies is not artificial. And objectively, looking at national output, it's hard to argue that the United States is, in fact, becoming more competitive with China. China now accounts for a remarkable 36% of world industrial production. We produce only about 1/3 of that. US manufacturing jobs have declined by 1/3 since they peaked in 1979, even as the US workforce has grown by 60%. Gross comparisons aside, China's real economy now outpaces the United States in many sectors. Its grain output of 700 million tons is 1.2 times ours. Its power generation of 9.2 trillion kilowatts is 2.3 times larger. China produces 19 times more steel and 20 times more cement than we do. Its auto production and sales figures are now triple ours. China's shipbuilding industry annually produces 70 times as much tonnage as ours does, something reflected in a Chinese merchant fleet, now second only to that of Greece, and the world's largest navy. China has displaced the United States as the top economic partner of most of the world's countries and is by now, by far, the world's largest trading country. The efficiency of China's transportation infrastructure, including high-speed trains, superhighways, urban subway systems, modern ports, and airports, is the envy of the world. China's installed solar power already exceeds that of all other countries combined. Its wind power installations now produce more power than those of the next 7 countries put together. China will meet its renewable energy goals for 2030 5 years early, in 2025, that is next year. The clean energy sector now contributes 40% of Chinese annual growth in GDP. In short, in addition to its huge lead in industrial production, China is indisputably becoming more rather than less economically competitive with the United States and other developed countries. This is reflected in its growing influence in Pacific Asia, where the US long dominated foreign investment, but dropped out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, in 2017, leaving expanded access to the world's fastest growing markets to others. Last year, Chinese investment in the region was up by 37%, and China logged a 14% increase in construction contracts. Second, to return to our stated goals, are we still more innovative than China? In 2020 alone, China graduated 3.57 million scientists, technologists, engineers, and mathematicians, or STEM workers. That same year, we graduated 820,000, about 1/3 of them foreigners, many of them Chinese. For the past 30 years, China has dominated the international Olympiads in biology, chemistry, physics, mathematics, and informatics. The United States has more unicorns, meaning startup companies with valuations of more than $1 billion than China does. But despite its rejection of financialized capitalism, China now has more billionaire entrepreneurs than we do. Last year, the Australian Strategic Technology Institute's, that is ASTI's, Critical Technology Tracker, reported that China has seized the lead in 37 of the 44 technologies it tracks. Many of the technologies in which China is now widely considered to be the global leader are those that will define the world of the future. They include wireless communications like 5 and 6G, electric vehicles, battery storage, fintech, quantum communications, hypersonics, robotics, green hydrogen, nuclear fusion, and renewable energy. Despite U.S. efforts to deny China access to advanced semiconductors, it remains neck and neck with us in the development of artificial intelligence and supercomputers. China has just announced a 10% increase in funding for science and technology projects. Meanwhile, the latest U.S. federal budget slashes spending on science and technology, with an 8.3% contraction in funding for the National Science Foundation, a 12% cut in appropriations for the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and a 5.9% reduction in National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, space programs. The United States is substituting strong rhetoric about competing with China for strong and effective actions. This is not a winning strategy. The prerequisites for continued American excellence in innovation include an educational system that emphasizes STEM subjects and an immigration system and domestic political atmosphere that attract the absolute best foreign talent. Historically, about 30% of US Nobel Prize winners have been foreign-born. But even as foreign universities, notably the top schools in China, gain ground, the continuing excellence of America's top universities masks the increasing inadequacy of American education at the elementary and high school levels. The latest ranking by the Program for International Student Assessment puts China and Singapore at the top, with the United States in 22nd place. Some German companies invested in the United States report that they need to give US high school graduates a half year of remedial instruction to bring them up to the level of their German counterparts. Taiwanese and Korean efforts to establish semiconductor fabs in the United States have been frustrated by shortages of sufficiently skilled labor. As the disproportionate number of Nobel Prize winners based in the US suggests, our country has long been a magnet for the world's best scientists. But our immigration system is now broken and the subject of rancorous political controversy. This, plus the special hostility of the US national security state to Chinese STEM students and faculty, has had a measurably deleterious effect on our ability to attract the most capable minds from abroad. 20 years ago, American universities enrolled 60% of the foreigners studying in English-speaking countries. Now we get only 40%. Meanwhile, a growing number of prominent Chinese Americans, some of our most innovative scientists and mathematicians, are responding to perceived harassment by US national security agencies by relocating to China. We are in danger of recreating the Red Scare of the 1950s that led Chen Shui-sun, an acclaimed aeronautical and cybernetic engineer at Caltech, to leave the United States for China, where he became the father of the Chinese ICBM and space programs. Such losses in our capacity to harness China's best minds to our future ensure that a good many of them will improve China's scientific and technological progress rather than ours. Third, what is the evidence of US, quote, resilience, unquote, and the, quote, persistent strength of US democracy, unquote? Both China and the United States seem to be suffering from an economic version of long COVID. The US has resorted to massive deficit spending to recover faster than China from this. But despite Washington's embrace of protectionism, subsidies, and industrial policies, our recovery has not produced the intended reshoring of overseas production by American corporations. It has instead lengthened and complicated supply chains by adding intermediary stops in places like Vietnam and Mexico, both of which have seen explosive growth in their exports to the US market. There has been a minor increase in industrial jobs, but despite a tsunami of illegal immigration by people eager to work, many jobs in the US have remained unfilled. Rents have risen, as have interest rates on credit card debt. Price increases have outpaced wages. The ranks of the disgruntled have grown. Meanwhile, US pressure on China has encouraged it to become more nationalistic and repressive. It is therefore a less attractive place than it was. China has diminished soft power, but its politics are not in crisis. Ours are. We can't seem to devise and implement strategies. China can. In America, polarization has replaced consensus. Incivility precludes productive debate of issues of public policy importance. Priorities, therefore, do not get set. Previously unifying national myths have become divisive. The basic values that underpin a decent and harmonious society are in dispute. A cult of personality has taken hold in one of the two major American political parties, while the other party is disorganized, despondent, and without a credible leadership succession plan. American politics have been captured by competing extremists and plutocrats. Boastfulness about the resilience of the American spirit does not make up for the lack of any tangible evidence of national rejuvenation. The public has very little confidence in government institutions. No one expects the upcoming US presidential election, which features a rerun between old men of dubious competence, to restore national unity. It's unclear whether this election will in fact be followed by the usual peaceful transition of power. American democracy is now best described as both decadent and dispirited. Happy talk about the persistent strength of US democracy has no credibility, either at home or abroad. To return to the list of US objectives, fourth, are Americans, quote, aligning, unquote, with allies and partners in common purposes and causes. The Ukraine war may have united the West against Russia, but it has alienated the US, G7, and NATO from the rest of the world. Washington extols the current transatlantic consensus on the need to oppose Russia, but it remains to be seen how long this will last after the war in Ukraine ends. In any event, intensive US efforts to align NATO members against China have registered only limited success. In many respects, the West seems bent on isolating itself from the rising and resurgent powers in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. They no longer accept the legitimacy of Western leadership of world affairs, still less that of the United States. The norms established in the European Enlightenment and imposed on the world by 5 centuries of North Atlantic hegemony inspired the American-designed post-World War II order. Various unilateral actions by the United States, all of them condemned by China and other rising powers, and many barely tolerated by US allies, have now blatantly violated these norms. Such actions have included, but were sadly not limited to, the use of force by the US and NATO to wrest Kosovo from Serbia in 1999, and in violation of the UN Charter, the resort to kidnapping, torture, and indefinite detention without charge at Guantanamo as part of the so-called US global war on terror from 2001 on. The unilaterally contrived US invasion and occupation of Iraq in 2003. The NATO and US regime change operation in Libya in 2011, and the subsequent abandonment of that country to continuing anarchy and chaos. The devastatingly destructive US regime change operations in Syria from 2011 on. The overt US role in the 2014 Euromaidan coup that overthrew the elected government in Ukraine and replaced it with one subservient to American strategic interests. Repeated US unilateral bombing of government troops and facilities in Syria beginning in 2016, and the overt U.S. military occupation of Syrian territory and plundering of Syrian oil reserves since 2017. Unilateral American withdrawals from arms control treaties and carefully negotiated agreements with other countries, for example, the nuclear accord with Iran, despite these having been endorsed by the UN Security Council and therefore become part of international law. The progressive abandonment of the terms of Sino-American normalization by once again taking sides in the Chinese Civil War, maintaining relations with Taipei that are now indistinguishable from official ties, restoring our military presence in Taiwan, and renewing an overt defense commitment to the island. Resistance to the repeated demands of the Iraqi government that U.S. forces withdraw, and the conduct of repeated violations of Iraqi sovereignty, for example, assassinations of anti-American politicians and security personnel on Iraqi soil. The contortions of Admiral Kirby and other administration spokespersons notwithstanding, it's impossible to reconcile U.S. support for Israel's genocide in Gaza, attacks on other countries' diplomatic establishments, pogroms against Palestinians in the occupied West Bank, or promiscuous assassination of its foreign political opponents with either international law or human decency. The 2-decade-long U.S. failure in Afghanistan, the inept U.S. policy that provoked the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, and the current U.S. enablement of Israel's universally condemned genocidal war on Palestinians have consolidated an extremely negative view of the United States outside the West. This view sees America as amoral, cynically hegemonic, and indifferent to the interests and strongly held views of other countries, murderously devoted to the use of force rather than the peaceful resolution of disputes, diplomatically incompetent, and self-righteously propagandistic. Despite the widespread devaluation of the American image internationally, the United States claims to have been successful in rallying China's neighbors to oppose it. Washington's celebration of its ability to persuade these neighbors to accept continuing American military protection, even as it reduces its economic and political engagement in their region, is unwittingly revealing. It imputes to China's neighbors a level of apprehension about China they do not share. Despite their concerns about China's return to wealth and power, with the notable exception of Japan, the countries of Pacific Asia have consistently made it clear they do not welcome Sino-American confrontation, and they do not want to have to align themselves with either Washington or Beijing. They all, even Japan, want to leverage China's rising prosperity to advance their own. But the U.S. not only ignores their desire to work out a safe and satisfactory modus vivendi with China as China returns to its millennial centrality in its region, but we actively oppose their efforts to do so. No one is fooled by Washington's assertion that it's not trying to force Pacific Asian countries to choose it over Beijing. This claim is belied by U.S. policy statements and actions. The operative driver of U.S. policy is clearly not the defense of Pacific Asia against a putative military threat from China. It is an obsessive desire to retain military primacy in the region. Ironically, the resulting confrontation with China has imposed new defense requirements on Beijing and provoked a massive military buildup by it. The result is a U.S. arms race with China that it, not the United States, gives every sign of winning. Far from promoting willingness on the part of other countries to, quote, align, unquote, with Washington against its designated adversaries, including Beijing, recent U.S. military interventions in Europe and West Asia have had the effect of discrediting the wisdom of contemporary American statecraft and impairing U.S. global and regional leadership. They've also destroyed faith in the United Nations, where the United States is seen as having high-handedly abused our veto power to override the strongly held views of all but a few other member states, thereby preventing effective international responses to global and regional crises and challenges. Mounting dissatisfaction with the hegemonic US role in the global system is inspiring the development of institutions with the potential to displace both the US and the UN from the center of a unified international system, as the West, composed of countries in the G7 and NATO stockades, exempts itself from the rules it previously made and once enforced. The rest of the world is turning to new regulatory structures in which China, not the United States, is typically the largest and leading member. Outside the West, the quote, rules-based order, unquote, espoused by the Biden administration is seen as a thinly disguised effort to replace the regulation of international affairs by the United Nations Charter and international law with US primacy and the principle that American might makes right. In this perception, Washington, sometimes on its own, sometimes in consultation with its followers in the G7 club of former imperialist powers, now asserts the right to make the rules, decide to whom they should and should not apply, and to enforce them or not on the basis solely of the expediency of American interests. This transparently revisionist approach to the regulation of international affairs creates highly objectionable double standards. These are resented and rejected by all but a few members of the international community. On many issues, the US is now completely isolated. Recent votes in the UN illustrate this. These include a 187-2 vote against the US embargo on Cuba and a vote of 153-10 against US opposition to a ceasefire in Israel's war on the Palestinians. Objections to perceived US high-handedness account for Washington's inability to marshal support for NATO's proxy war with Russia. Given its inability to persuade other countries that its views merit their support, Washington has embraced coercive diplomacy, notably unilateral sanctions, as its preferred approach to statecraft. Sanctions are a form of economic warfare that violate international law unless approved by the UN Security Council. But they're now the principal measure short of war in the US foreign policy toolbox. The US has been able to impose unilateral sanctions because our national currency is also the principal medium of international transaction settlement. Dollar-based sanctions now cover 1/3 of the world's peoples. Those subjected to such sanctions resent them as a humiliating American negation of their sovereign right to decide their own foreign aid and their own foreign and domestic policies. Fear of US unilateral actions has become the principal driver of a burgeoning global movement to replace American dollar hegemony with a system in which the sovereignty of foreign states and people is reflected. Washington has designated Beijing as its peer competitor and primary global adversary. China has not surprisingly reacted by reaching out to other countries to reduce its and their vulnerability to US coercion by building alternative communities, organizations, and regulatory structures that are multilateral, but regional rather than global. These new structures, ever more of them under the auspices of the so-called BRICS grouping, cover trade, investment, and finance, as well as quasi-judicial, political, and military matters. Their implications for future American global primacy are dire. The BRICS is an intergovernmental organization that is often characterized as the counter to the G7 bloc of Western industrial democracies. The members of this rapidly expanding grouping, which currently consists of Brazil, China, Egypt, Ethiopia, India, Iran, Russia, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, and the United Arab Emirates, account for about 45% of the world's population and a growing share of its GDP, now about 1/3. By contrast, the G7 has about 9% of global population and generates a declining percentage of world GDP, now less than 30%. But the former imperialist powers of the G7 still hold 60% of the world's wealth. BRICS members have divergent national interests, but they share opposition to what they regard as bullying and disdain for their views by the United States and other NATO and G7 members. As BRICS membership grows, the grouping could gradually achieve primacy in the global political economy. In the long run, moreover, if great power rivalries continue to prevent the United Nations and related post-World War II institutions from addressing international and transnational issues of concern to the global majority, the BRICS has the potential to grow into an alternative, multilateral rule and decision-making forum that could gradually sideline major parts of the UN system. This would prevent Washington from using its veto to block global initiatives and enforcement actions and enable the BRICS to offset, counter, and frustrate both US unilateralism and Western efforts to remain in command of the international system. For now, the primary economic security concern of China, Russia, Iran, and other BRICS members is countering US national security-based protectionism. Washington has sought to replace the liberal order enshrined in the World Trade Organization, or WTO, rules and regulations with bilateralism that relegates dispute settlement to zero-sum contests of economic strength. Global opposition to national security-based protectionism has found expression in new multilateral bodies seeking to regulate international trade and investment, as well as in a growing network of regional free trade agreements, or FTAs. Many of these link other countries to China under the Belt and Road Initiative. There are already almost 30 such agreements with China now in place. Another 10 or so are under active negotiation. The China-ASEAN FTA, CAFTA, is in the process of being liberalized and upgraded. It already facilitates a level of trade approaching the world's largest bilateral economic interactions, US-Canada, US-Mexico, and US-EU. The United States was historically the global leader in rulemaking and trade liberalization through the WTO. It's now mostly disengaged from international trade institutions and thus from policy formulation by them. American protectionism and foreign emulation of it contributed to a fall of about 5% in global trade in 2023. Most countries remain committed to the WTO and its rules, but since 2019, Washington has sought to exempt the US from international trade law by preventing the WTO's dispute settlement mechanisms from functioning. Other countries, including China, which have prospered under the rules set in the WTO, have responded to this sabotage by establishing alternative and ad hoc arrangements to perpetuate them. Multilateral provisions for dispute resolution are a feature of most of the subglobal groupings coming into being. One such, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, in which China is the largest economy, already accounts for about 1/3 of global GDP. Bilateral FTAs now routinely include provisions bypassing the WTO by creating mechanisms for the adjudication or arbitration of disputes. Earlier, after the US repeatedly rebuffed the recapitalization of American-dominated global financial institutions, China responded by working with other countries to launch new institutions to supplement the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, or IMF. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB, complements the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. The new Development Bank does the same for the World Bank and potentially the IMF. The United States boycotted both new banks, predicting they would undermine prudent lending standards and adversely affect established financial policies and practices. Washington urged US allies to keep their distance from the AIIB. With the very significant exception of Japan, they instead joined it. The US has not been moved by the fact that the new banks have in fact followed the Bretton Woods rules often co-financing projects with the World Bank and Asian Development Bank. The AIIB now has 109 members. By staying out of the new international financial institutions, Washington has not isolated China. It has instead denied itself a role in shaping the evolution of the newly emerging global political economic order. China and the other BRICS countries, as well as members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the China-ASEAN Free Trade Area, are now actively instituting currency swap arrangements that facilitate trade and transaction settlement digitally in national currencies or in the Chinese renminbi rather than in the dollar or euro. NATO-sponsored sanctions on Russia and other countries have caused them to set up trade settlement mechanisms that do not require going through SWIFT, the Brussels-based Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunications, which the United States controls. The dollar has long had a monopoly in global commodity markets. China is now, by a considerable margin, the world's largest consumer and importer of raw materials and other commodities. This makes it vulnerable to US dollar-based financial sanctions. So China has begun to encourage the use of new renminbi-denominated commodity and futures markets in Shanghai. All this reflects a widening international, not just Chinese view, that it is time to break the global hegemony of the dollar and replace it with a multinodal financial system involving multiple currencies and trade settlement mechanisms. It's not clear that Americans have an effective response to this effort to dethrone our longstanding ability to use our currency to force our policies on other nations. This brings me to the last of the three elements of the administration's strategy, blocking China from a role in global governance comparable to our own. So fifth, are we presenting a vision for the future that bolsters our claim to global leadership over that of China and other countries? Frankly, it's not clear what vision for the future the United States means to build other than the perpetuation of our global military primacy. The Chinese challenges to our global standing are primarily economic and diplomatic, not military. But Washington's answers to these challenges are almost entirely military, rather than economic or diplomatic. China will attack the United States only if we attack it. A US war with China would therefore be a war of choice, not necessity. It's entirely up to us to decide whether we should risk such an attack by intervening in the unfinished Chinese Civil War to ensure Taiwan's continued separation from the rest of China, or by escalating our military support of non-Chinese claimants to the disputed rocks and reefs in the South and East China Seas. Quite aside from the risk of a nuclear exchange that would devastate both the Chinese and American homelands, the only certain result of a war between China and the United States would be the destruction of Taiwan's industrial capacity, including its semiconductor production, and its democracy. A war over Taiwan is very much not in Taiwan's, China's, ours, or the world's interest. Simulations of a Sino-American war by the Pentagon show that it would likely cost China and the United States the greater part of both our navies and air forces. It could easily escalate to a nuclear exchange between the Chinese and American homelands. Those in Washington who advocate policies that could produce such a war have plainly not thought things through. I hope they will, but I don't propose to do that for them today. I have briefly reviewed what seems to be happening in our economic and technology competitions with China. They don't seem to be going our way. Unfortunately, at the same time, American actions have called the sagacity of our statecraft and the soundness of our strategic reasoning into question, to the detriment of our influence abroad. Diplomacy is how a country advances its strategic objectives by measures short of war, influences the policies and practices of foreign countries, advances its economic interests in markets beyond its own, safeguards its citizens and their businesses abroad, and shapes the international system to its benefit. This requires more than the denunciation of foreign governments and their leaders. Punitive economic measures, unilateral policy pronouncements, occasional visits by officials from Washington, and threats to use force. Diplomacy relies on building relationships with the governments and peoples of other lands. This takes consistent effort over time and depends on empathy, informed by situational awareness, and influence born of a long-term diplomatic and consular presence on the ground. Successful diplomacy depends on intelligent, affordable statecraft. In this context, we've become our own very worst enemies. Political polarization and dysfunction paralyze the Senate confirmation process. Many U.S. ambassadorial positions in important foreign capitals remain vacant, sometimes for years. China keeps its diplomatic missions staffed on a timely basis. Over the last decade, the Department of State and the U.S. Foreign Service have suffered huge budget cuts. By contrast, over the same period, China's spending on diplomacy has roughly doubled. China now has more diplomatic representation in more places abroad than any other country, including the United States. The current Chinese budget includes a further increase in spending on diplomacy of 6.4%. Meanwhile, we repeatedly resort to force rather than diplomatic dialogue to deal with foreign lands. This is proving both ruinously expensive and ineffectual. We need to rediscover the merits of peaceful engagement and coexistence with other nations and peoples, including the Chinese. Let me conclude. The Biden administration is right about one thing, even if it's doing far too little to achieve it. Americans do need to get our national act back together. Doing so is the sine qua non, the unavoidable requirement for competing effectively with China and other rising and resurgent powers. China is now by a considerable margin the world's largest industrial power and its biggest trading economy. We cannot isolate it as we did the Soviet Union. Tariffs will isolate us, not China. Installing crude facsimiles of Chinese industrial policies at home will not enable us to surpass China. More fundamental reforms in our economic structure will be required. Cooperation with China and welcoming Chinese investment in the United States could boost our prosperity. Politically inspired economic protectionism will not do this. China now has the world's largest population of scientists and engineers and is emerging as a major source of scientific and technological innovation. The United States does not have the power to hold it down or push it back. What we are doing is depriving China of reasons to buy our goods and services, encouraging it to engage in import substitution, and driving it to collaborate with everyone other than us. The Chinese STEM workforce is young and ambitious. Necessity is the mother of invention. We're not holding China back so much as incentivizing it to develop its own technologies without regard to us. We are thereby depriving ourselves of advances in technology that everyone but Americans will have access to. This weakens us, even as it strengthens China and its relations with other countries. China can and will take care of itself. It's taking risks and making progress. We should do the same. Criticizing China and gloating at its mishaps while ignoring our own failings and doing next to nothing about them is a politically performative approach to competition with no prospect of succeeding. China bashing will not restore our constitutional order, resurrect the rule of law, revive competition in an American economy now dominated by oligopolies, fix the financial capitalism that leads companies to export jobs rather than retrain workers to be more productive, or reindustrialize America. It will not revamp our educational system, cure our addiction to opioids, or repair our broken politics. These are things that only we Americans can do. China recognizes that it needs a peaceful international environment, openness to foreigners and their ideas, and a commitment to continuous self-improvement to realize its potential. So do we. We have a great deal more going for us than China, but we should be exploring ways to leverage China's advancing prosperity to our own, not preparing for a war with it that neither of us can hope to win. It's indeed time to demonstrate our resilience and the strength of our democracy. Lofty talk and belligerent posturing appeal to domestic populists, but neither is a substitute for strategic vision, political courage, and effective action. Where are they? Thank you.
Ambassador Freeman, thank you so much. That was a very provocative talk. You've given us a great deal to think about. I have a few comments and questions
Sure.
for you. One is, I mean, your talk is highly critical of the Biden administration or the U.S. government positions generally, and I guess one of my reactions to that is this actually is the beauty and the strength of the United States. I mean, you talk
Yes.
about resilience. I think we are a resilient country precisely because we can have people like you who are knowledgeable and can speak plainly about what our shortcomings are, what our mistakes are, and it gives us the ability to do course corrections. And I'm gonna push you a little bit on some of these course corrections and ask you to elaborate on what you think we should do. Although I suspect, just looking at your speech, I suspect what you're going to say is we should pretty much do the opposite of everything we are doing. It's
Exactly.
because we're not achieving the results that we said we're trying to achieve. But I think we're going to ask you for some specifics around that. A lot of your comments really resonate quite well with me because living in China and representing the American business community over there, the American businesses have, a very close-up view of a lot of things that you're talking about, which is, the competitiveness of China, the competitiveness of the economy, all the things that are, frankly, going quite well in China. One of the comments when I talk to CEOs over there of American companies, and we have this conversation, why are you in China? What do you like about it? Why are you staying here? And there's a lot of conversation about, the size of the market, et cetera, and so on. But one thing that 10 out of 10 CEOs say is they talk about
Yes.
the infrastructure and how China has built up this extraordinary infrastructure. There's the high-speed rail, the airports, the ports, the roads, the bridges, everything. And then we come back to the United States and we see quite a contrast. And to be completely fair, our infrastructure is old. China is actually new, right? Because of reforms and opening up, and they didn't have much infrastructure before, whereas we've been at it for quite a while. And so our bridges and airports are falling apart. The other thing I wanted to react to is the AIIB, your comments about that. I couldn't agree with you more. I remember when that happened, and I kind of looked at it and I said, why wouldn't China have its own development bank? And when it was launched, there was a lot of discussion about trying to build out infrastructure in Central Asia. And I looked at it and said, gee, well, it's not like the United States has done this great job in Central Asia. Why not let China kind of have a crack at it? If they can build a few roads and bridges over there, great. I mean, that should be helping everybody. So there was tension. I mean, it was obvious to me as a student of economic history. It was obvious to me that every rising power would want a bank like that. In fact, if people would recall, at the end of the Second World War, the United States and Great Britain, although we were allies in the war, fought like a cat and a dog for power, for where would the World Bank be headquartered? Where would IMF be headquartered? Who would be the boss? So we had that battle already. And so why would it be so surprising that that a new country would come along and would like to have their own development bank that would like that they'd like to have headquartered in their capital, just like we wanted the World Bank to be headquartered in our capital. So that seemed quite natural to me, and I've had a lot of conversations with Jin Lichuan, the president of AIIB, and he was very specific with me. He said, "Yeah, we've got this board of directors. There's a seat there that's empty, and it's waiting for when the United States sees the light and is ready to occupy that seat. He's ready to welcome the United States." And I had some fairly candid conversations with Ambassador Baucus, who was Obama's ambassador, and Jack Lew, the Treasury Secretary, and they all but in private, frankly, they all but admitted that it had been a mistake and that we had pretty much painted ourselves in a corner on that. But anyway, so that's a couple of remarks and reactions from me. We're going to turn to some questions from others, but let me launch one or two at you if I could. Ambassador Freeman, first let's go back to the competitiveness of China. Can you react to the criticism that so did they do it fairly? And I definitely take your point on the WTO. That's the other thing, that the American business community reacted to the trade war with confusion, frankly, for all the points that you just mentioned. It's like, is the WTO not the framework that we are promoting here? And President Trump launched into this bilateral, just clearly violating WTO rules and norms. But go back, if you can comment on that criticism that that China, and setting aside the IP argument, because that's kind of a rat hole, but really focusing on the system itself. Are they competing fairly? Did they compete fairly in order to get to where they are today? And part of that question is also, and here, this is a little bit of a rhetorical question, so deal with it however you like, but would you conclude so that Beijing is right, that they're, and I'm being a little bit provocative here, if you'll forgive me, that China's political economic system actually is superior? That's the narrative that comes out of Beijing. And my personal narrative is I don't go that far. I kind of would rather say there are things that we can learn and emulate from every system that's not exactly like ours, and we should sort of pick and choose. And again, we should be self-critical. What are the things that in our system that aren't working? But how do you react to those two things, just to kind of get us just started? Has China competed fairly, and what do you say about their political and economic system?
Let me begin by saying that I completely agree with you that free speech, debate, discussion of issues, and vertical communication from the bottom up are really the keys to good government. And I think historically, those have been features of our system. At the moment, however, we have a group of people whom some have called the deplorables. Some of my best friends are deplorable, I guess, and they feel left out by the elite. They feel ignored. They don't see their lives improving while the plutocracy gets richer and richer. They don't see anyone in Washington listening to them. They see a lot of posturing and no action. And confidence in our system is at an all-time low. And part of it is political correctness and partisanship, which inhibits the kind of discussions that have historically been our strength. Now, turning to China, I would say one of the great issues in China at the moment is the suffocation of speech in an increasing national security state. I was very impressed. I ran the embassy in China in the early 1980s, which was the Deng Xiaoping revolution getting underway. Hu Yaobang was the party chairman or the general secretary. And I was terribly impressed by the extent to which people at lower levels were able to put radical ideas before the leadership. And even when Tiananmen happened, if you read the papers, the police reports that went to Deng Xiaoping and others, they're remarkably candid. That was a strength of the Chinese system. I don't see much evidence of that today. I think there are very few people who dare to walk in to Xi Jinping and tell him that he's full of it, that he's wrong, that he's making mistakes. I don't think that happens. And I think that is a great danger to the Chinese continued progress. So I agree with you completely, but I don't think we're doing very well in that regard at the moment. You talked about the AIIB, Jin Liqun. I knew very well when he was at the Ministry of Finance. I think he's a splendid human being, and he's been a very good head of the AIIB. China didn't want that. China tried very hard repeatedly to get the World Bank recapitalized, to take on payment for development infrastructure abroad. It tried to get the ADB, which is basically Japanese dominated, to do the same. And it was frustrated. And it was driven in the end to create its own institution. But this wasn't its choice. China would have very happily lived with the Bretton Woods institutions if they could be made to work. But they weren't working. They were out of money. They weren't lending adequately. And they were the prisoners of economic theories that are somewhat dubious. So that's the background there. Did China achieve success fairly? Well, I'm not sure what that means. They achieved it differently. But I think the great feature of the Chinese economy is the fierce competition within it. It is not dominated. It has state enterprises, of course, dominating the heights of certain parts of the economy. But the greater part of the economy is fiercely competitive, whether it's privately held or publicly held at the local level. People are all out to succeed. And one of the reasons that businesses go to China, I assume you experienced this in Shanghai, was the incredible availability of competitive supplies. In the United States, if you have a supply relationship with someone, you're getting widgets from them to integrate into your product, and you have a falling out, because a lawsuit or something, or they go bust or whatever, you maybe have one or two choices. In China, if that happens, you've got 50 people on your doorstep the next day offering to replace the partner you just lost. So from a business point of view, it's a terrifically competitive place. And we see that in the constant lowering of prices, now deflation, which is a major issue. And finally, I would just say, you mentioned IPR. I dealt with that when I was in Taiwan many years ago. Taiwan, of course, moved all its counterfeit factories to the mainland once the mainland opened up to it. But the interesting thing is, if you review our own history in the United States, you will find that until 1898, which was the year in which we became a net exporter of intellectual property, we took the position that everything was the common property of mankind, and we were the greatest violator of copyright and trade marks of anybody in the world. So I think if you go to old bookstores, even today, you can find Charles Dickens books printed on lousy paper with bad bindings. These are all pirated editions. The first thing we did as a country, Alexander Hamilton hired two guys to go to England and purloin their textile technology. And that is how the first textile plant got started in my home state of Rhode Island. Anyway, I would just say that these things take care of themselves. In 1898, we became a net exporter of intellectual property, and we got religion. We became fierce proponents of intellectual property rights. Japan did the same thing in the 20th century. And then it too became an exporter, and it got religion. And China is getting religion as it becomes innovative. Finally, question of whether the system is superior or not. Question is, in what respect? I think the Chinese have invented a very, very effective combination of capitalist markets and government guidance. The policy banks, which are authorized to lend to specific types of projects upon doing due diligence. It started out, they didn't know what due diligence was. They made all kinds of mistakes, but they've learned. And so Chinese industrial policy works. I'm wondering whether Goldman Sachs, which has been given responsibility for our industrial policy in some areas, is going to do as well as they do. Our economy is not geared to that. I think we need fundamental restructuring. We need antitrust. We need to break up monopolies and oligopolies. We need to restore competition. We need to put labor unions on management committees in companies so they don't just fire people, but retrain them. We need to rein in private equity pillaging of companies. There are lots of things we need to do. We need a new tax system. And we need to curb the excessive wealth of the plutocracy, to restore faith in our own system, and to make it more efficient. And if it is more efficient, it can compete very well with China. If we can't compete, that's not China's fault, that's ours, because we're the ones who put in the system that we have. And we're the ones, you look at what's going on with TSMC in Arizona, they're having a hell of a time putting together that fab. And they're still going to be making most of their 2 nanometer chips in Hsinchu, not in Taiwan, not in Arizona. Subsidies, we have a bad record in recent years. Of course, the American economy was built on subsidies. The railroads were subsidized by the federal government, which gave land to the companies and allowed them to sell it off to people along the tracks. The Postal Service financed the aerospace industry. We had airmail stamps before we had airplanes carrying mail. DARPA has been a major factor in everything we've done in the electronics area, starting with the transistor, which was invented at Bell Labs, but funded by DOD. The first computer that was operative was in a US Air Force aircraft. And, we have used industrial policy very effectively until recently. Now we've decided somehow we have a better idea, which is the government doesn't do anything and you let private business do it all. Well, private business can do all sorts of things, but look at the space program. How do you think SpaceX and the other and its competitors came about? They came about because the government developed the technology and turned it over to the private sector to operate it. How did we get vaccines for COVID? Same process. So I think we need to rethink our system. We have wonderful things going for us in every respect. We have an incredibly rich continent. We have it. We have a great diversity of people. We have most of the best universities in the world are still in our country. And we have a history of invention. And we have invented various mechanisms of funding it. And we need to restore all that. It's not working. So no argument with your points. In fact, I agree with them.
Yeah, fair point. Somewhere along the line, industrial policy became a dirty word. And I think a lot of us who went over to work in China kind of saw some of the positive aspects of having a pretty decent plan. Most of the American companies, didn't have a rejection to these 5-year plans. It was actually a pretty good blueprint for where we could go and where we couldn't go. It was actually a fairly transparent process for everybody. We weren't happy. There were things in the plan that we weren't happy about, but at least we knew kind of where we could go. Ambassador, let me bring in a couple of questions. We've got some questions queued up here, and I'm going to combine two of them. They're somewhat similar. One of them is for someone open-ended, and it's connected to another one. Let me read them off for you. Larry Crump says, first, thank you very much for your insightful analysis and presentation. Do you feel there is any real hope to refocus the U.S.-China relationship, given the political environment we find in each country? So that while you're thinking about that, it's fairly open-ended. Is there hope? And then while you're thinking about that, there's another one that another question. Oh, I just lost it. Sorry.
Well, we go
lost. They're sort of related to that. Given the litany of U.S. misbehavior all across the world that you've cataloged, can we hope for sanity on Sino-American relations? Will a recalibrated U.S. policy only proceed if we ourselves can fundamentally reform our entire foreign policy? And is there hope for that change without reining in the domestic interests that are gorging on profligate military spending? So no loaded question. But what's your reaction, Ambassador Freeman? Is there hope?
I think yes. Of course, there's hope. There's always hope, and in due course, we will rediscover the imperative of cooperating with China. It looks to me as though we're on a course to try the opposite. We're not going to cooperate with China. In fact, we're doing the opposite. Just today, I believe President Biden put 30% tariffs on steel and aluminum from China. President Trump said he's going to put a 60% tariff on everything from China. I don't believe that, but if that's what he does, watch out, American consumer. I mean, I think we're imposing pain and lost opportunities on ourselves, and at some point we'll wake up and change that. China, for its part, is decoupling from us, and it's doing it out of the same motivations that led us to decouple. We now see a ban on American chips in Chinese government facilities, a command that computer makers replace them with others. The reason for that is national security. The Chinese have very good reason to believe there are back doors built into our equipment, that our technology companies cooperate with our espionage agencies. This is what we accuse the Chinese companies of doing. We accuse them because we know that ours do it. So we assume they must be doing it. There's a lot of suspicion. But the basic problem, and I see the relationship in some ways paralleling the Sino-Soviet split, which was irrational. China and the Soviet Union had a falling out around 1960. It took them 25 years to begin to reestablish a normal relationship. I hope history moves faster than that in the case of the American split with China. But the basic problem in both cases is the same. It's very hard to have a cooperative relationship with China or any other country if your basic premise is that their government is illegitimate and their system should be overthrown. And that is the American ideological position. And we express it, daily. We have a special committee in Congress that specializes in statements designed to offend the Chinese ideologically. In other words, we have a habit of saying, you can't have normal relations with us unless you behave like us. Mm-hmm. You must become more American. Well, there is not an American inside every Chinese struggling to get out. The Chinese are Chinese. They have their own ways of thinking of things. And for their part, they're not asking us to change at all. They're not imposing ideological demands on us or anyone else. So I think we need to go back to the Shanghai Communique formula, which was the two sides recognized that we had very different socioeconomic systems and ideologies, but agreed nonetheless that we would look for ways to cooperate in the common interest. But at the moment, we're in a very ideological mood, and we're not going to do that. So I would say it's going to take a while. And I hope it's not 25 years, but it will be likely to be a decade or so before we find a new footing for this relationship. So optimistic in the long term, but not in the short term. And I'm sorry, now the first question, which was related, was what? Now you've lost me.
Well, they were pretty much related. I take your point about the regime change comment. I think the other you mentioned the Select Committee on Competition with the CCP. I would also point to Secretary of State Pompeo's
his wolf
one
warrior
of his
diplomacy.
last speeches, which he gave. Exactly. Yeah.
You know, I mean,
I think he
they
gave that
didn't
speech at
invent
the,
that.
ironically, the Nixon Library.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
the
And
those speeches and the Chinese counterpart, from a diplomatic point of view, are about the dumbest thing you could possibly do. I mean, this is the opposite of any effective strategy. Maybe we'll get that back. I don't think Pompeo will be back because he's been disloyal to Trump. But we're very likely to get Trump, in my view, not for any reason connected with China, but other reasons, and having to do really with the disgruntlement of the populace that I mentioned. They don't know what they want, but they don't want what they have. They want something different. And one thing you can say about Donald Trump is he's different. So I think we're going to get that, and that's going to put things on ice for a while.
It is indeed. Let's go to a couple of other questions, Ambassador, if you would. This question comes from our co-host, Professor Ge. She says, Ambassador Freeman, you mentioned that China now leads the world in renewable energy production and renewable energy production technology. Would you please comment more on how U.S. and China could collaborate on green energy? And if you could broaden that question, you mentioned collaboration and the fact that no mention was made of it in the Biden strategy. What would your roadmap be in terms of how we would cooperate? What would that look like if the U.S. were to collaborate? And would you focus on green energy, as Professor Ge seems to be suggesting, or would you pick some other thing, perhaps global health? We see how well we did cooperating on the global pandemic, but are there other areas that you think there are possibilities to collaborate?
I think there are many areas. I think we have to distinguish here between government-to-government cooperation and private sector or corporate cooperation or university cooperation. Government-to-government can set a framework, but the actual cooperation's got to be done by companies and by universities. China does have the world's leading technology in quite a number of areas. I mentioned a number of them. At the moment, we seem to be going in the opposite direction of collaboration. Take electric vehicles, for example. Everyone seems to agree that electric vehicles, if they can be made sufficiently efficient and the battery storage problems can be addressed, are a much better way to get around than the internal combustion engine in terms of climate impact, environmental impact, and so forth. And basically what we're proposing to do is to ban the import of the world's best EVs, even if they're made in Mexico. Trump says not one of them is going to get in here. So, notwithstanding our free trade agreement with Mexico. So, if that's our approach, it's just going to move us farther and farther behind, and it's going to retard our progress. In the case of solar panels, we cooked up a human rights argument for banning everything from Xinjiang, which is where most of the silica comes from for the solar panels. I think forced assimilation of Uyghurs is a problem, and it's rightly condemned. It's not genocide. If you want to see genocide, look at Gaza. You don't have to look very far. Nothing like that is going on in Xinjiang. Anyway, we chose to put a human rights posture ahead of our own ability to install solar panels. The sensible approach would have been cooperation, including getting Chinese companies to invest in making them here, and university collaboration to improve the technology. No, that's not what's happening. It's the opposite. We're cutting it off. I would say, yeah, public health, exactly. China is becoming a major producer of very interesting and effective pharmaceutical products, a lot of them in the anti-cancer area. And, it's been because of the size of the population and its willingness to allow clinical trials, it's become the platform for a great many clinical trials on new drugs. That's a sensible communication and collaboration. We ought to build on that. Of course, our pharmaceutical companies basically have used IPR to exact exorbitant profits. There have been lots of scandals in the area. I don't need to tick them off. Getting a low-cost producer of generics, and actually, a great number of our pharmaceutical companies depend on supplies from China. The supply chains go there. Anyway, I would say yes, many, many areas of collaboration, some of them on planet-wide problems like climate change, environmental degradation, remediation. It can't be addressed except with the US and China working together. And here I would go back to the early days of US-China relations when the relationship was, not quite as bad as it is now, but not good. And there is, in diplomacy, if you can't cooperate directly, often you can find a way to work in parallel. This means you agree with the other party that an objective is desirable, but you say, we're going to try to get to that objective in our own way, and you do it in your way. This actually came up in the Nixon visit when the Chinese interpreter, we talked about parallel action, and the Chinese interpreter gave the mathematical definition, which was bing xing bu bei, lines that never intersect, that go in parallel and never intersect. And I said, no, this is not what it means. It means yi tu tong gui, to reach the same result by different paths. And they actually accepted that. But I'm saying, if you can't work together, maybe you can agree to work separately to the same end, and have a healthy competition. What we have is not rivalry, which is a healthy competition in which each side tries to win by improving its own performance. We have a track meet, people train, and then they try to outrun the competition. We have an adversarial relationship where you try to trip the other guy, or you hamstring him, or you try to win not by improving your own performance, but by degrading the other sides. That doesn't work. It's to no one's advantage. And we need to get off that, in my view.
Let me ask you a follow-up question. What will it take to bring the sides back together? You suggested track. Maybe we could address some of these things in parallel, which is an interesting idea. But if your goal is to get the countries back together, and you mentioned the Soviet-China split, and also, if you go back to the U.S.-China rapprochement, you could argue that it was because of the split between the Soviet Union and China, and then the U.S. withdrawing or getting beaten in Vietnam, that brought the country, that got Nixon and Mao to see that it was both of our best interest to get together. What will it take this time around? What is the event or events that would need to take place that would bring the U.S. and China back together, in your view?
We'll need to clear the air. I fear that will be done in a violent fashion. I fear we'll have a war over Taiwan. I don't think the Chinese want that. They want a negotiation. That's what they've consistently wanted. We're clearly against that, whatever we say. The United States has never tried to improve the prospects for cross-strait cooperation. We have accepted every improvement that the two sides have worked out, but basically we have relied purely on military deterrence. And we've now, as I said, gone back on all of our undertakings on how to handle that issue. So we're gonna have to get rid of that. And I would argue we're going to have to get rid of our hubris. You know, we imagine we can democratize the Middle East and transform every other country to be just like us. There was, since you lived in Shanghai, you probably remember the famous American senator who came out in the mid-1930s to Shanghai and gave a speech at dinner, which he ended with the following words. He says, "And with God's help, we will lift Shanghai ever up until it's just like Kansas City." Well, that is a kind of hubris we need to get rid of. So I think we're going to learn from failure. You never learn from success. You know, you only learn from failure. You learn from what you learn from success is a complacent attitude. We can't be complacent anymore. We're losing ground, not just with regard to China, but generally. Look at where we are. We're in the process of suffering a strategic defeat in Ukraine. The world has turned against us on our posture with Israel. We're headed towards some kind of confrontation with China. You know, we have these meetings in Beijing or on the telephone between Xi Jinping and President Biden. And the only thing they can say at the end is, well, we kept the channels of communication open. They can't claim they actually did anything, you know, to improve the relationship or to cooperate. So we're in a bad position. We need to get out of it. And that will require some talent in our government that doesn't seem to be there at the moment.
No. And you've used the word hubris several times during this conversation. That seems to be.
Well, the Chinese are guilty of that too.
Sure.
You know, I mean, this is, in some ways, we resemble each other because we never admit that we're wrong. We never make mistakes. They don't either. They never make mistakes. You know, this is foolish in my view, but it's something Americans and Chinese share.
In fact, this somewhat related to, and we're running close to the end of our time, you're saying right now, and this comes from Professor Liang Wang, who happens to be actually the director of our CPSI. Professor Wang writes, Ambassador Freeman, as someone who witnessed the history of the two countries' diplomatic relationship, does the recent ever-rising tension surprise you? What are the surprises that people did or didn't anticipate? And while you're thinking about that, he's got a follow-up question, which says, Mr. Freeman, in the USA, who benefits economically from the economic decoupling between the USA and China, and who suffers from this?
Two very good questions. I'll answer the first question in two ways. Yes, I'm surprised and dismayed at the bad turn in U.S.-China relations, which I don't think serves the interests of either country. But on another level, I'm not surprised, because if you look at the history of China or U.S.-China relations, every 10 years, there's a swing in the pendulum. You know, 1911, William Howard Taft forced railway bonds on the Qing government, which led to a nationalist protest in Wuhan, which became the 1911 Republic of China Revolution. In the 1920s, the United States was passive as China fell into anarchy and warlordism. We were trying to make money, but we were not politically engaged. In the 1930s, we watched and wrung our hands for a long time over the Japanese rape of China, 14 years of rampaging through China. We finally reacted by putting sanctions on Japan, which got their attention, so they attacked Pearl Harbor. That's what sanctions do. They do not ingratiate you. In the 1940s, we tried to mediate a civil war between communists and nationalists and failed. 1950s, we had no relationship at all with the mainland, and we were supporting the right of Taipei to represent all of China in the UN and internationally, Chiang Kai-shek, even though he'd lost the civil war on the mainland. 1960s, we were in denial about the emergence of the Sino-Soviet dispute until Nixon recognized that it had happened and exploited it with his own opening to China. 1970s, we had an uneasy relationship aimed at normalization, but we couldn't achieve it because of Watergate in the US, because of the Gang of Four in China. 1980s, we had a blossoming of the relationship as Deng Xiaoping tried to use the United States to de-Maoify China and move it in a different direction. 1989, so the June 4th Tiananmen suppression then took all the air out of the relationship. That same year, Taiwan democratized. And so we had in the 1990s, we tried to bring China into conformity with world institutions. We got them into the WTO at the end of the 90s. That was good. Then we started off in the year, of course, we had a little problem with the Belgrade embassy bombing, and we had a spy plane in 2001. And we had in the first decade of this century, if it hadn't been for Osama bin Laden attacking us, we would have gone after China. We set that aside, but we went back to it in the second decade. And we are there now. So if you look at this relationship, it's one that goes up and down and all around just about every decade. So in one sense, I'm not surprised about the volatility of the relationship. As for who benefits economically from decoupling, the answer really is nobody. This is a trade policy devised not by American business, but by lawyers. Bob Lighthizer is a lawyer. He is not a businessman. He is not an economist. We had Peter Navarro in there, death by China. Now he's in jail for being loyal to Trump and committing perjury. Anyway, I don't see any benefit. When we have put tariffs on China, it has, as I said, not led to reshoring. It has led to the diversion of supply chains to intermediate stops in Vietnam, Ethiopia, Mexico, Bangladesh, India, wherever. It has not led to an increase in industrial employment in the United States that's noticeable. There is some slight increase, but very slight, and not attributable to our policies. So I don't see who benefits. I see it as a political posturing that really doesn't help very much of anybody, except I guess it helps the politicians get reelected because they've persuaded people that it's a good idea. The Chinese Communist Party is out to get us. Really? How many Chinese Communist Party members are sitting around trying to get you to change your mind? My experience with Chinese Communist Party is that there are more communists in Cambridge, Massachusetts than there are in all of China. And I include the Central Party School, which I'm very familiar with, in that. We have basically come at this, many of us, with the attitude that you've seen one communist, you've seen them all. Well, that is not the case. If it is, how do you explain Vietnam, which is our great buddy now, but far more corrupt and equally repressive as China? So that's my answer, Mr. Liang.
Fantastic. Well, with that, we're already over time, and I think that actually is a good wrap up. Those your final comments, and with that, thank you so much, Ambassador Freeman. I really appreciate it. I've enjoyed our conversation. I've learned so much from you, and again, thank you for the service you've given to our country over so many years. And with that, I'm going to hand off to our new executive director, who's the Professor Wang. Liang Wang is the executive director of the Center for Business Studies and Innovation for Asia Pacific. So I'll hand off to you, Liang, to wrap up.
Thank you, Mr. Gibbs. And I really enjoyed the talk, and I learned a great deal. And the comment, Ambassador Freeman, you made at the end, in terms of the relationship going up and down, at least this gives me hope that, perhaps, hopefully history will take a different turn, benefiting, U.S., China, and the entire Asia Pacific. And I want to really thank Ambassador Freeman and Mr. Gibbs for the talk. And the talk really is very insightful and interesting. And I also want to give thanks to Professor Xiaohua Yang, Professor Steve Roddy, and our student ambassador, Ms. Poonam, and for planning on the webinar. And lastly, I want to thank our partner, Professor Gloria Ge, from Griffith University Asia Institute. Thank you for the partnership. And lastly, CBSI AP, or is short for the Center for Business Studies and Innovation in the Asia Pacific. And the center leverages its unique location in San Francisco and the Silicon Valley to facilitate, interaction between academic, business, and the broader communities in the U.S. and the Asia Pacific. And I want to thank everyone for participating in tonight's webinar, and we look forward to seeing you in the future. Thank you.
Thank both the University of San Francisco and Griffith University for this program, and I hope that we can meet again at some point. And thank you, Xiaohua.